I wanted to talk this week about a really useful NuGet package I came across that solves a problem that you sometimes get if you're trying to use media queries alongside Blazor. Now, media queries are a CSS concept, and therefore, because CSS and Blazor work side by side, they work perfectly well with Blazor in most cases. But there are situations when you want to access media query information programmatically inside your Blazor app, and that's what this NuGet package does for you. Now let's begin by just looking at the basic idea of Blazor and media queries, and I've got a simple little application here that if I run it up, we can see this is a Blazor WebAssembly app, but the same thing would apply with Blazor Server, and very simple web page here. And if I just bring up the dev tools, you can see that we could set this for, say, onto an iPhone SE, and that will show us what the layout looks like when we've got an iPhone up there. So we can turn that on and off just with this button here in Chrome and similar things in other browsers as well. But if I were to, say, rotate that and put it into landscape mode, or indeed if I were to just switch to responsive so we can mess around with it and see what's happening, you'll see that however wide I drag it, we've still got the picture and then the text underneath. And it might be better to use up our screen real estate by putting those side by side if we've got enough space. And that's what we do with this idea of media queries. So if I go into the code for this and just look in here, there you can see we've got the home page. So there we've got the image and then the text. And then related to this, I've got a CSS file. So I'm using CSS isolation here, and that's just where I've got some bits of CSS to make that look good. And you can see that the way this works is we've got a display of type flex with a flex direction of column, and that's being applied to this article. And because it's column, it means it puts these two things one on top of the other, which is what we could see there. And so what we'd like to do is make it so that rather than having a flex direction of column, we had a flex direction of row. And if I save that, you can see that now they're side by side, but we'd like that to switch dynamically when we hit a certain width. So that's what I'm going to do. And we do that with one of these media queries. So all I need to do is in the CSS file, I say at media, and then I say screen. And the reason for this is this will only apply if we're displaying this web page on the screen. The main alternative to that is we can have print. If we're actually trying to print out the page, we can have different styling for that. But we're going to go for screen, but then we say and then we put the circumstances under which we want to change the behavior of the CSS. So what I'm going to do here is say min width, and then let's go for 750 pixels. And what that means is that the CSS that I put into this media query is going to apply if the screen width is 750 or above. So for the wider screens, basically. Put some curly braces in there, and then I put the extra code that I want. So I'm going to say article again. So that's what we're selecting on for the CSS. And then all I need to do is put in what I'm changing. And we saw what I wanted to change was to have a flex direction that is going to row. And so now the standard HTML will apply in a narrow screen situation, but as soon as we get to 750 or wider, then it'll switch to going for row. So if I save that and go back here, we can see there they're side by side, but as I drag it in, when we hit that point, they go to the column and go vertical. If I go to something like, say, the Samsung Galaxy S20 Ultra, there we can see that when it's in portrait mode, we've got the one way of displaying it. But if I switch to landscape mode, therefore it goes over that 750 and we have it the other way. So that's how CSS media queries work. And you can see they just work perfectly well alongside Blazor because they're just manipulating the DOM that Blazor has created. But sometimes you want to go a bit further than that and have an actual programmatic change of some kind when you hit that threshold, whatever it is, for your min width. And so we want to be able to do that in the code. So for example, let's suppose that we wanted in this homepage, we were going to have, instead of that fairly simple message, we're going to put in a component that I've already written that's just called terms and conditions. And you can see that I've just put that over here in components, and it's just a load of text for terms and conditions. But the thing is now, if we run that up, and again, bring up the dev tools so we can see what's going on, we can see here that although it still works in terms of switching to the side or the bottom, when we're getting really small, if we've got it on something like an iPhone SE, it's a lot more text than we really want. So what I'd like to do actually is, although I'd like to display that if there's plenty of room, on a smaller screen, I'd like to simply put in a link to a different page that shows what's going in there. So let's put that together. So first thing I'll do is put that different page. So let's just add a new Razor component, and I'm going to just call this terms. And then we will, in there, just give it a root. So this is going to be on /terms, and then we'll just put into there the terms and conditions that we just had. And also let's just put an anchor with an href of just slash that we'll call back. So that'll just take us back to where we came from. And we can quickly test that that's working. So if I now run that up and navigate to terms, then we can see we've got the terms and conditions, and the back will take me back where I wanted to go. So what we want is to have a link to that switching in based on the media query. So what I could do this entirely once again in CSS and media queries, and we'll start out by doing it that way. So what I could do is in here, we could have that section, and I'm going to put a div there with an ID of terms, and then another div with an ID of link, and in here I'm just going to say click and then the anchor to href of /terms, and then here for T's and C's. Okay, but the point is we only want one or the other of those divs to appear. So let's say we could do that entirely within CSS. So I'm going to do another one of these. I'm going to say at media screen, and then I'm going to do this as a slightly narrower. And then what I'm also going to do is make it so that when we are narrow, we're not going to see the full terms and conditions, we're only going to see the link. So I'm going to select with a hash terms, so that's going to be this div here, and I'm basically going to say display of none. So that will make it disappear. And then when we're wider than 500, that's where I'm going to put hash terms display to be block. And also, so we can put as much as we like into any one of these media queries, I'm going to put hash link and display as none. Okay, so when we're narrow, the terms will be none and the link will by default be block. And then when we're wide, we're going to switch that. And so if I run that up and again go to there, then we should be able to see when we go to responsive that when it's fairly wide, we're seeing the full terms and conditions, but when we get too narrow, it switches to the click here, and obviously we can click there and have a look at them. But the slight issue about that, why that's not a perfect solution, is if we take a look at what we've got going on in there, then you can see that both of those divs still exist in the DOM. We haven't removed the terms from the DOM, we've simply put it there, but then not displayed it by setting its display to none. And that's not a particularly efficient way of doing things. That means you've got things in the DOM that have to be managed that have no purpose in being there because they're not being displayed. And if that component that I've got for the terms was doing a lot of heavyweight work in the background, it would still be doing it even though we'd never see any results. So one of the big things that we have with Blazor and with lots of front-end frameworks is we deliberately want to remove things from the DOM rather than simply putting them in there and then hiding it. And so in Blazor terms, we'd actually like to have a razor if statement in here. So we'd like to be saying, if one condition, show that, otherwise show that, and then only one thing would be in the DOM. And so what we need to do is in our C# program, get hold of the same information that's happening with the media query we've got there. Now that's something that can be done in JavaScript, and therefore it's available to JavaScript front-end frameworks, and it would also be available to us by using JavaScript interop. But as is so often the case, when you've got some nice feature that's available in JavaScript, somebody has already written a NuGet package to do this for us, and so we can just install the package, just program in C# and Blazor and not worry about the JavaScript. And so that's what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to do is add this NuGet package, and what it is a thing called ProBlazor.BlazorSize. So you can see there's some other libraries from the same author, this chap called Ed Charbonneau, but we're just going to go for that one, so we'll install that. And then to get that working, there's just a few things that we have to do. The first thing we have to do is set up a bit of dependency injection. So we go into the program and I'll add a using for this Blazor Pro.BlazorSize. And then in here, I'm just going to say builder.services.add media query service. And that's what we need to do in there so that it can be injected at the appropriate time. Next thing we're going to need to do is, well, actually, let's just put in another using. So on our imports.razor, let's put a using in here so we don't have to keep repeating ourselves everywhere else. So that's going to be Blazor Pro.BlazorSize once again. And then what we have to do is wrap any code that is going to use these features with an extra component. And typically, because we want this across the entire application, we just put it into the app.razor and actually wrap it around the router. So here, I'm going to have a thing called media query list. So that's what's just come out of that namespace that I put in the imports.razor. So we just wrap that up around there, and that now means we can make use of it. And then the final thing is in our actual component, we can then read a media query. So let's go into home.razor. And what I'm going to do to start with is just in the code, I'm going to have a private. It's always going to be a Boolean. And then I'm going to call this one _hide link. So if that's true, we hide the link. If it's false, we hide the terms and conditions. And then what I'm going to do is put into the markup this thing called a media query. So we've had the media query list at the top level that wraps it all up, and then you have your individual media query. And what you put in there is media, and then exactly the same query that you'd have in your CSS. So in our case, we want to have min width 500 pixels. So that's what we put in there. And then we say at bind matches, and then bind it to that Boolean flag that we just created. So in this case, _hide link, and finish that off. And that will now mean that automatically that hide link variable will be set to the appropriate value depending on whether we're less than or greater than the 500 pixels. And let's just demonstrate that by putting in just down here, let's just put in a paragraph with hide link in there. So we can see exactly what's going on. And if we run that now and bring up the dev tools, well, you can already see there we've got the false. And if I expand it and scroll down, there we've got the true. So it's true when we're nice and big. And then as soon as we go below, we've got false. So it's working in the right sort of way. So basically, we're looking at that media query, and if it was doing exactly the same as we see in the CSS, so less than 500 is false, greater than 500 is true. So then all we've got to do is put this all together. So we don't need the divs anymore. We can say at if, and then hide link. So if we're hiding the link, that means we're showing the terms and conditions, and so we can just put that into there. And then we can have an else. And again, put that code straight in there. We'll still need a div just to group it all together, but we don't need the ID or anything like that. So put that in there. That should now all be happy. And then finally, let's just remove that bit of debug code where we're looking at the hide link. And let's also go in here, and we can now remove that media query because that's what we've replaced in code. And also we don't have to set terms to display none because it's not going to be there at all. And so now when we run that up and we go into DevTools, so you can see there when we're small, it's saying click here for T's and C's. When we get bigger, we get the full T's and C's. But the important thing is, if we actually look at that, then over here, you can see that's all there is. So just the click for the terms and conditions, we don't have any hidden DOM components at all. And if I expand that, then we'll see that suddenly disappeared, and there we've got the article with the full terms and conditions in there. So although in this case it wasn't a huge overhead having them both there and one of them hidden, you can imagine that that sort of thing can become a problem. And also in more complicated situations where we need to determine something based on the media query, that's the way we'd have to do it. So really neat feature. Obviously, if you can get away with just putting your media queries into CSS, that's going to make life easier. But in those occasions when you do need to access them from your Blazor, then that's a really nice NuGet package for doing that, and very, very simple. A little bit of setup with things like the dependency injection, but then really just putting that media query in there. So that was it. Not something you're going to be using every day, but when you hit that sort of problem with a media query, it can be really useful. So hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.